There was that spring widespread provocation amongst the pro-slavers, and threatening noises from the clans of border ruffians, and at Brown Station we were increasingly agitated and kept ourselves in a constant state of alarm, if not readiness. Then one day late in April, the pro-slavery Sheriff Jones rode over from Atchison to Lawrence with a small posse of U.S. troops and apprehended 6 Free Soil citizens. That same night, an unknown person shot Sheriff Jones as he and his troops were leading their prisoners off to Atchison. The prisoners did not flee, however, and Jones did not die of his wound. In fact, to my and my father's astonishment, the entire town of Lawrence and its leadership were aggrieved by the shooting and publicly apologized for it and condemned the unknown shooter outright. The shooter, of course, was me. In company with the old man and my brothers, we had learned of the sheriff's mission and had ridden over towards Lawrence to help oppose it, and at nightfall had come up on the posse and prisoners on their way back to Atchison. The old man was all for throwing down on them at once and seizing their prisoners and delivering them safely back to Lawrence. I said, "No, it's near dark. They'll hear us coming and will run, or else they'll use the prisoners as hostages and put up a fight. The prisoners may be killed and the slavers escape." "But Jones and his men are cowards at heart," the old man argued. "They're just conscripts, and the Lord will protect his children." We were perched unseen in the growing darkness on a rise hidden in a stand of black walnut trees, and Sheriff Jones' party was heading slowly along a draw below. "Look, it's almost too dark to do anything at all," I pointed out. "But I can bring down the sheriff with a single shot now." I got down from the wagon box and took a position behind a tree and leveled my rifle. "Hold up, son. Maybe we should think on this a bit." "If we think on it, the opportunity will be lost." I did not say it, but we both knew that if I did not drop the sheriff now, Father would once again be in a foaming rage, crying that nothing had been done to oppose this outrageous illegality, and he'd be blaming the men in Lawrence for their failure of nerve instead of himself for his. He nodded approval, and I aimed and fired. Done. Sheriff Jones toppled from his horse. A simple act, but instantly, with that shot, much changed. With that one shot, we shucked our identity as defenders of freedom and became full-fledged guerrilla fighters. It was around this time that Father decided that we had better send the women over to Osawatomie. He also decided to abandon Brown Station and move to a temporary camp that every few days we could shift to a new location. We were free as the wind off the plains now, able to appear and disappear almost at will. Everything we owned we carried in one wagon, and most of what we owned was weaponry. Who can say which event is accidental and which is not, or even if there exists such a thing as a true accident, a purely causeless event? When you take away belief in God's will, then every untoward event and every blessing is viewed as merely the result of history, or else its origin is said to be a mystery, or else we lamely reason backwards from effect to cause, from consciousness of guilt, for instance, backwards to the sinful act. Thus, if my feelings of guilt were made a measure of my intention, I have to concede that even though I was not aware of it at the time, I nonetheless fully intended to kill my beloved friend Lyman Epps, and only arranged for it afterwards to resemble an accident in my own eyes as much as in the eyes of others. By the same token, I fully intended to go down there along the Pottawatomie Creek that night and haul 5 men who claimed to love slavery and hate Negroes out of their cabins and butcher them for the sheer murderous pleasure of it. But if events are driven not by a man's unconscious desires, and not by pure mystery, and not by some deep unknown historical force, then what? After all, I was not obliged by circumstances or by any other man to go there with my sword and brandish it the way I did. No, I hold myself responsible for my own bloody acts, and I believe that I am further responsible, and to nearly the same degree, for the bloody acts that night of my father and brothers too, for without my having instigated the attack, and then goaded them when they grew timorous and frightened by the idea, they would not have done it. In a matter of weeks, Kansas would have been admitted to the Union as a slave state, and there would have been nothing for it then but the quick secession of all the northern states and the wholesale abandonment of 3 million Negro Americans to live and die in slavery, along with their children and grandchildren, and however many generations it would take before slavery in the South was finally, if ever, overthrown. There would have been no raid on Harper's Ferry, certainly, and no Civil War. When we went down to Pottawatomie, I believed all that, and in spite of my guilty feelings, I believe it still. The terror and the rage that we caused with those murders ignited the flames of war all across Kansas, and all across the southern states, and in the north as well. We turned Kansas bloody. With a single night's work, we Browns made the whole territory bleed. We drew the wagon into a narrow cleft in the rutted, steep ridge on the north side of the trail, with the cabin of James Doyle a quarter mile or so dead ahead, and Sherman's and Wilkinson's a short ways beyond. It was pitch dark, but we lit no torches. I instructed the boys to hitch our horses here and place our rifles in the wagon and leave them. Then I handed out the razor-sharp broadswords. No one else spoke a word, not even Father. By the time we reached Doyle's cabin, it was close to midnight. There was a quarter moon in the southeast quadrant, casting a shifting, eerie light. We could see the rough, pale wooden shingles of the roof of the cabin below, when we heard a low growl, and suddenly a pair of huge, mastiff dogs came charging towards us, all fangs and ferocious yellow eyes. With a single swipe of my sword, I sliced the first animal across its neck and shoulder, and it fell dead at my feet, nearly decapitated. Fred struck at the other, injuring it in the haunch, sending it howling into the woods behind us, away from the cabin. Father stopped in his tracks. "Ah, we're done for. The Doyles'll be up and armed now." "No," I said, "just keep moving fast. Don't hesitate. They'll likely think the dogs are chasing deer. Come on." And I jogged down the trail to the cabin. When the others arrived at the stoop with me, I banged roughly on the door with the handle of my sword. A man's voice inside drawled, "Who's there? What do you want?" I looked to Father, whose leathery face had gone white. His cheek twitched and his lips were dry and trembling. I was afraid he would not speak to the man, and I could not. Finally, after a few seconds, the old man cleared his throat and asked in a thin voice the way to Mr. Wilkinson's cabin. Friend Wilkinson, he called him. Words were Father's saving grace. I would not have thought to say that. I heard someone push back a chair and walk across to the door and lift the bolt away, and when he had opened the door a crack, I kicked it and swiftly put my shoulder into it, throwing the door open and tossing James Doyle back across the tiny room, and we all burst into the cabin, sending the Doyles back against the further wall, where they cowered in fright, astonished by our sudden, huge presence. And when Father shouted to Mr. Doyle that we were the Northern Army and had come to capture him and his sons, Mrs. Doyle at once commenced to weep, and she cried to her husband, "I told you what you were going to get. I told you." She wept profusely and for a moment dominated the scene, mainly by begging Father not to take her son John, who was only 14, she said, a mere boy with no notion of these things. Father said to her, The others, your eldest sons, are they members of the law and order party?" "Well, never mind that," bellowed Doyle. "What do you want with us? We ain't but farmers like you, Brown." "Thou art the enemies of the Lord," Father pronounced, and he ordered the two grown sons, Drury and William, and the father to come out of the house with us, which they did, leaving wife and mother, son and daughter, sister and brother, weeping and wailing behind in the doorway, for they knew what was about to happen. Quickly we marched the three men, coatless and hatless, back up the pathway to the moonlit road. Oliver, Fred, and Henry were in front, Father, Salmon, and I coming along behind, and when we reached the level plain above the creek, 100 yards or so from the cabin, where the dead dog lay, Father said to stop now. One of the Doyles, William, saw the dog and cried, "Oh, Bonnie!" Father said, "The law of Moses states that the fathers shall not be killed for the crimes of the sons, nor the sons for the crimes of the fathers. But here, father and sons, both are guilty." "It's not necessary that they understand what's happening to them," I said. "Let's just get it done." I remember raising the blade of my sword over my head with my good right hand, the moonlight glinting off its edge like cold fire, and then I brought it down and buried it in the skull of James Doyle, splashing Drury with his father's blood. Fred and Henry Thompson and Salmon joined in and began hacking away at the brothers, chopping them apart at the arms and slashing them in their chests and bellies, and even Oliver got in some blows with his sword. Sinew, muscle, bone, and blood flew before our eyes. And Father, where was Father? All the while he stood away from us, and he alone did not use his sword. He watched. And when we were done with our murderous work, when the Doyles were lying at our feet in bloody chunks and pieces, making huge puddles of blood on the ground, Father stepped forward and drew out his pistol. He leaned down and placed the barrel against the cloven head of old Doyle and fired a bullet straight into the man's brain, as if into a rotted stump. "The others will hear that," I said to him. "Let them hear it," Father said. "It will make no difference. Come, boys," he said, and led us down the trail towards the Wilkinson cabin on the claim adjacent to Doyle's. Here the old man, for the first time, took charge completely. He banged on the door, and before anyone inside had a chance to answer, he demanded to know the way to Dutch Henry's cabin, which was widely known as a meeting place for pro-slavery settlers. When there was no reply, Father waited a moment and then said, "Are you of the law and order party?" Meaning, was he pro-slavery? Wilkinson answered forthrightly, "I am, sir." "Then you are our prisoner. I order you to open your door to us at once, or we shall burn the house down around you." Wait a minute. Let me get a light," Wilkinson said. Father replied that he would give him 30 seconds and commenced counting, but before he'd reached 20, the door was opened and we all marched inside the cabin. Here again was a terrified wife and 4 children, little more than babies. "My wife is sick," Mr. Wilkinson said. "Let me stay with her till morning. Post a man here, and you can come out for me then. We got us a woman coming in then." Father ignored his drawling pleas. He set Oliver and Fred to search the house for weapons, and they quickly turned up a rabbit gun and a powder flask. "Bring them with us," the old man said. Salmon and Henry he told to pick up the pair of saddles that were lying on the floor next to the door and carry them up to the road. To Mr. Wilkinson, Father simply said, "Come along now," and pointed the tip of his sword at the man, whose face went rigid at the sight of it. He made no answer and walked stiff-legged from the cabin. The wife called after him, "Dad, you'll want your boots." "He won't be needing them," I said. "What are you going to do with my husband?" "Nothing," I said. "We ain't going to do nothing to him. Just make him our prisoner." "Why? What's he done?" "For exchange, we'll exchange him with the Missourians for one of ours," I said, and stumbled backwards from the cabin and ran to catch up with the others, who had disappeared into the darkness ahead. By the time I reached the place where the path joined the main trail, they had already killed Mr. Wilkinson, and he lay on the ground in a splash of moonlight with his throat slashed, a huge, toothless yawn from one side of his massive jaw to the other, and he had a great raw wound on his skull, as if he had been scalped by Indians, and one arm had been nearly severed from the trunk. "All right now," Father said. "Let's get on to the Sherman cabin." But then Oliver began to cry. "I don't want to do any more of this," he wailed. "I can't." I said, "Maybe Oliver should go back for the wagon, come down along the trail and pick up these here saddles and so on and meet up later with us below." "Yes, fine, do that, Oliver. The rest of you follow me," Father said, and we went down to our final stop, the cabin owned by Dutch Sherman. It was he whom we had most particularly gone looking for that night, and as it turned out, he was the easiest to kill, not because we hated him more than the others, but because he physically opposed us, fought us furiously until he was finally dead. Evidently he had heard the gunshot and had come out to investigate, for we met him on the road a short ways from his cabin. He was standing by the side of the road, urinating, and had not heard us approach. We threw down on him with our swords and Father's revolver, and Father said that we were capturing him for the Northern Army. "You are our prisoner, sir." He buttoned himself up slowly, methodically, and glared at us, all the while muttering in his hard accent, "So it's you damned Bible-thumping Browns, is it? You are worse than the niggers. You are a pack of goddamn hypocrites coming around here in the dead of night like this for robbing a man to terrorize him." When Father answered, "The only thing we're robbing you of tonight is your life," Mr. Sherman went wild. He exploded in fury, grabbing the barrel of Father's revolver with one hand and punching him repeatedly in the face with the other. When Father could not get the weapon loose of his grip or protect himself from his pummeling fist, I was obliged to bring my sword into play, and with a single stroke severed the man's hand at the wrist. Both hand and revolver fell to the ground. He howled in pain and rage and charged at me with his head lowered and butted me in the face, bloody in my nose and knocking me backwards onto the ground. With his remaining hand he grabbed my dropped sword and swung it like a scimitar in a wide circle, clearing a space to stand and hold us at bay. His severed hand lay on the ground, and his chopped wrist sprayed blood, draining him white. Yet still he staggered in a circle, flailing the sword at us, causing us to leap back from him and look for an opening to take him down. I had scrambled back to my feet, my face covered with blood, and when I saw Father's revolver lying on the ground next to Mr. Sherman's hand, I darted over to it, grabbed the weapon, and from a crouching position looked up into the maddened face of Dutch Sherman looming over me. His sword, my dropped sword, was about to come down on my head. At the same instant, as I shot the man in the chest, Henry caught him from behind across the midsection with his sword, and Fred sank his sword into the man's shoulder. He was dead before he hit the ground. No one said a word for a long time after that. Void of feeling and thought, we stumbled down to the creek and washed our swords and our hands and faces in the cold water, and waited there for Oliver. When, after about an hour, Oliver still had not come, Father abruptly got up and walked back along the road a ways to Dutch Sherman's cabin, and returned leading a pair of horses. So we would be called horse thieves as well as murderers, assassins, cold-blooded executioners. But just then we heard the familiar sound of the wagon creaking down the road towards the creek, and a moment later it appeared, with Oliver looking terrified and aghast. He had passed all the sites of our killings, had observed the mangled corpses on the ground from his seat up on the wagon, and the bloody spectacle of it had changed him. Father said to Oliver, Are you all right, son?" "I feel dead," he said in a flat, cold voice. "I feel like I'm dead." "Then you are all right. You can't feel otherwise, son, after a thing like this. There will be no more of it, I promise thee," he said, and climbed up into the wagon and took the reins. Fred and I climbed up behind Salmon and Henry on the stolen horses, and the 6 of us quickly rode out of that ghastly place. Behind us, in the east, the rising sun would soon crack the black, flat line of the horizon. Their long, ragged strips of silver-blue clouds lay banked in tears, tinged with red as if the heavens were bleeding. Let them bleed, I thought. Let the heavens rain down on us in goblets and pour rivers of blood over the earth. Let the sky bleed all its color out, and let the earth be covered over with gore. I no longer care. Let the soil stink and turn to a scarlet muck, and let us crawl through it until our mouths and nostrils fill with it and we drown in it with our hands on each other's throats. I no longer resist this war. I relish it. There commenced a lengthy period in which hindsight could be called the calm before the storm, although we did not know then that the storm was truly coming, even though Father increasingly predicted it. He never said the name of the place, Harper's Ferry, Virginia, the town down in the very heart of the slavocracy. He called it Africa. But we knew roughly the place he meant, and that a new, more dangerous and more consequential work on a different front was about to begin. My father's gradual progression from anti-slavery agitator to terrorist and martyr seemed at the time of its occurrence a reasonable and moral response to the times. Father may have been the first to resort to pure terrorism for political and military purposes, but the wisdom and necessity of it were early on as plain to the other side as to us. They never needed our example to inspire them to butcher innocent civilians. And without Father, that's what I would have been, merely an innocent civilian, wifeless, childless, and alone. Easy pickings for one of the roving bands of ruffians who would have treated me as they treated so many other isolated free state farmers and herdsmen. They'd have shot me dead, burned my cabin, stolen off my sheep and horse, and ridden on to the next farmstead. Sometimes I think it would have been better for me, for Father, for our entire family, for everyone, if it had happened that way. Better if back in Springfield, when Father gave me leave to go my own way, I had gone. Go, Owen, follow your elder brothers to Ohio and beyond, if that's what you prefer. Or follow the elephant and go to California in search of gold, if that interests you. If I had taken him at his word, had forsaken what he called my duty, so many terrible things would never have happened. The death of Lyman Epps, and there would have been no Potawatomi killings and possibly no war at all in Kansas. There would have been no debacle at Harper's Ferry, no Civil War. Think of it. Father would have ended his days peacefully as a farmer and preacher in North Elba, dying in old age in his bed, surrounded by his beloved family, and buried in the shade of his favorite mountain, Tawas, the Cloudsplitter. We wake in darkness and long for light, and when the light comes we wait for darkness to return, so that we can warm our hands at the kitchen fire and walk about the yard a while. We go out of the house either in pairs or alone, so as not to draw the attention of some errant nighttime traveler unexpectedly making his late way past the old Kennedy farm, who would surely note the presence of 10 or more men milling about and wonder why they were there. The house is surrounded by woods, however, and is fairly remote, so that a pair of men, or a man alone, if he remains silent, can stretch his cramped limbs and breathe cool, fresh air, and from the road no one would see him. The town of Harper's Ferry, and the rifle and musket manufactories, and the federal arsenal are situated in a deep, narrow gorge 3 miles south on a spit of terraced land where the Shenandoah cuts between 2 high, wooded ridges and empties into the Potomac. We have said our somber final goodbyes to our families and homes in the North and have joined the old man here, 15 white men and 5 Negro, to wait out the days and weeks and months until he tells us finally that the moment we have been waiting for has come. His meticulously detailed schedule and breakdown of operations he has rehearsed for us over and over again, night after night in the chilled, candlelit room above the one big room of the house. A short ways from the house is a locked shed where we have stored our weapons, some 200 Sharps rifles, and that many more pistols, and 1,000 sharpened steel-tipped pikes, all paid for by Father's secret supporters and shipped over the summer months in wooden cases marked hardware and castings. John Caggie, who once taught school in the area and knows it well, has functioned as our main advance agent here. Also, John Cook has been here for nearly a year already, sent by Father as a spy because of his intelligence and Yale education, and his much-admired social skills, and he has managed to gain employment as a canal lock tender. We ourselves have arrived in a trickle, a few at a time. First, on July 3, Father and I and our old Kansas cohort Jeremiah Anderson came in from North Elba, and soon after came Oliver and Watson and the Thompson boys, William, Henry, and Dauphin. From Maine comes Charlie Tidd, and with him Aaron Stevens, both hardened veterans of the Kansas campaign, and shortly after them Albert Hazlett, followed by the Canadian Stuart Taylor. A week later, the Kopek brothers, Edwin and Barclay, arrived. Then, late in the summer, William Lehman will walk all the way in from Maine, and shortly after him come the first of the Negroes, Osborne Anderson and Dangerfield Newby, which pleases Father immensely, for he has begun to grow fearful that his army will be made up only of white men. July has turned into August and is moving rapidly towards autumn, and as each new recruit joins us, Father begins his narrative anew, an old Jeremiah against slavery that lapses into fresh prophecy of its demise, as weekly he adjusts his plan for the taking of Harper's Ferry, so that it reflects the skills of the new arrivals, his increased belief in his recruits' commitment, and his growing awareness that there will be far fewer of us than he anticipated. Finally, one night, Father climbs up to our attic and, taking his customary seat at the center of the group, begins to speak. This time, however, when he has gone through once again, step by step, the taking of Harper's Ferry, he is silent and looks somberly at his clasped hands as if in prayer. After a long moment, he abruptly declares that tonight he has decided to reveal to us that we will not be conducting the sort of raid that most of us believe we have come here for. There is instead a much larger task before us, a greater thing than we have yet dared imagine. After we have taken Harper's Ferry, we will make our appointed rendezvous with Mr. Douglas in the Allegheny foothills west of here, as planned. But then we will not hole up in small forts and siphon escaped slaves into the north. Instead, we shall divide our forces into the defenders under Mr. Douglas's command and the liberators under Father's, and whilst the defenders protect and hurry into the north those slaves who wish to resettle there, the liberators will march rapidly southward along the north-south mountain passes, making strikes against the plantations on the plains lower down, seizing armories and arsenals and supplies, building a cavalry like Louverture, and even seizing artillery like the Maroons of Jamaica, destroying railroads and fortifications. When the Shenandoah Valley goes, the plantations along the James River will quickly fall, and then the Tidewater tobacco farms, and when Virginia goes, the rest of the southern states will nearly conquer themselves. The flames of rebellion will leap like wildfire from one district to the next until we have ignited a great encircling conflagration which cannot be extinguished until it has burnt the ancient sin and scourge of slavery entirely away from one end of the South to the other, until at last nothing remains of the slavocracy but a smoldering pile of char. The old man's peroration is met with soft silence. Kagi, Cook, Stevens, and Anderson look slowly around the room, as if searching the faces of the others for a sign that their collective silence indicates collective skepticism, or dismay, or simple awe. I look to my brother's eyes, seeking a clarifying version of my own thoughts and feelings. Watson and Oliver and the Thompsons, all of the men wear a single expression, the hungry look of a true believer. There is no Thomas the Doubter in this room, no sober skeptic, no ironist, no dark materialist. We have all been confined here in this isolated place for too many weeks and months to have any mentality left that is not a piece of a single mind. And that mind is shaped and filled by Father alone. Shortly after nightfall on a Sabbath, it will begin. Father will say simply, "Men, get on your arms, we now proceed to the ferry." I am to stay behind with Francis Merriam and Barclay Cobuck. I would prefer to be at the front with Father and the others, but I know better than to object, and besides it places me in a position of authority as second in command and at Father's flank, so that if something goes dreadfully wrong, my duty will be to rescue them. We have 2 wagons, one for my use and the other for Father's advance party. It must be on a night with no moon shining, no stars, overcast and drear. And when Father's men have loaded their wagon with the 100 pikes and 20 rifles they require for the taking of Harper's Ferry, immediately and without ceremony they will set off, Father on the wagon seat and the 16 men marching silently alongside and behind. After a few moments, when we can no longer hear the tramp of their boots or the creak of their wagon, my men and I will turn quickly to our tasks. Merriam and Cobuck to load our wagon with the remaining weapons from the shed, whilst I gather all our scattered papers from the house. By candlelight I will prowl carefully through the entire house, collecting every shred of paper I can find. Soon I will have made a large, disordered pile. But when I commence to sort the papers, I will discover, with a little shock, that a whole heap of them are Father's. Dozens of letters, many from family members and others, only slightly coded, written by his secret Northern supporters, and even several letters from Frederick Douglass, and receipts for purchases of arms and all of Father's maps and Cook's drawing of Harper's Ferry and Father's pocket notebooks. While I clear the house and my men stack the arms into our wagon, father and his men will be nearing the covered bridge that crosses the Potomac from Maryland into Virginia and the town of Harper's Ferry. This is how it will go. Around 9 o'clock, the drizzle shifts over to rain. At 10:30 they reach the Maryland Heights, steep wooded cliff above the Potomac. Father and his men descend on the narrow, winding lane to the grassy river bank and march for a while alongside the wide, swift-flowing river to the covered bridge. Father halts the wagon at the entrance for a moment and stations Watson and Stuart Taylor as rear guard on the Maryland side. Then, at the old man's command, Kagi and Stevens march straight into the mouth of the bridge. 50 yards back, Father follows in the rumbling wagon, and the rest of the men march wordlessly along behind. A few moments later, Kagi and Stevens emerge from the long throat of the bridge. They are the first of the raiders to enter the town, and as soon as they have set their boots onto the rain-slicked cobbles of Potomac Street, a watchman hears this step and calls, "Who goes there?" Kagi answers, "Hello, Billy Williams. It's a friend." The watchman draws close and lifts his lantern and says, "Oh, it's Mr. Kagi," and they instantly throw down on him and take him prisoner and douse his lamp. The raid has begun. Osawatomie Brown and his men are inside Harper's Ferry and have taken their first hostage. The raiders move rapidly and efficiently from one place and situation to the next, exactly as planned and rehearsed. Turning right on Potomac Street at the B&O train depot, they pass the deserted porch and darkened windows of the Wager Hotel and head straight towards the armory situated between the railroad siding and the canal. On the left is a 2-room structure that serves as a guardhouse for the armory. When Father has drawn the wagon close to the iron gate, the watchman, Daniel Whelan, cracks open the timber door, squints into the darkness, and reluctantly steps outside into the rain. In a sleepy voice, he says, "That you, Williams?" "Open the gate, Mr. Whelan," Father says. "You're not Williams," says the watchman, more confused than frightened. At once, Oliver and Newby step forward with their rifles leveled and take him prisoner. Aaron Stevens grabs the crowbar from the wagon and twists it into the chain holding the gate. When the lock snaps, he and Kagi swing open the gate and Father drives the wagon straight into the yard. The other men, including the 2 captured watchmen, follow at gunpoint, and Kagi swings the gate closed again. Now Father climbs down from the wagon and, turning to his dumbfounded prisoners, declares that he has come here from Kansas, for this is a slave state, and he has come to free all its Negro slaves. "I have taken possession of the United States Armory," the old man calmly continues, "and if the citizens of the town interfere with me and my men, we must burn the town and have blood." Father now proceeds to dispatch his men to take control of the remaining arms, supplies, and defenses of the town. Under guard by Dauphin Thompson and Lewis Leary, the 2 hostages are shut into the firehouse, while Oliver and Will Thompson are sent to take command of the bridge that crosses the Shenandoah River into town. The toll booth proves to be empty and the bridge unguarded. Hazlitt and Edward Kopek take over the arsenal, also unguarded, just off the main square and inside of the hotel, where they will wait for further orders. Stevens, Kagi, and Copeland are ordered to the rifle factory. Once more, a single watchman is surprised and, when captured, is marched by Stevens back to the firehouse, leaving Kagi and Copeland behind to hold the rifle works. On his return to the firehouse, Stevens comes upon 3 half-drunk, unarmed young men, carousers straggling home late, and he swiftly puts them under his gun and brings them in with the watchman. It is not yet midnight, and both bridges into town, the armory, the arsenal, and the rifle factory have been brought under the control of the raiders. 6 men have been taken hostage. Unknown to the rest of its citizens, unknown to the world, Harper's Ferry, Virginia, belongs to Osawatomie Brown. Around this time, the rain lets up. Just before 1 a.m., as father expected, a fourth watchman, Patrick Higgins, comes to relieve Williams at the Maryland side of the Potomac Bridge. As he enters the covered bridge, Watson and Stuart Taylor step from the shadows and capture the man. They commence marching him over to the firehouse, when suddenly Higgins turns and swats Watson on the forehead and races ahead of them into the darkness. Before Watson can stay his hand, Taylor raises his rifle and fires, his bullet slightly grazing the forehead of the escaping man, who is able nonetheless to get safely into the Wager Hotel, where he is the first to raise the alarm. This is an eventuality that father has anticipated, and so long as it happens after the bridges and the arms stores have been captured and hostages have been taken, it does not much concern him that sometime in the night a shot or two will be fired, alerting the citizens that a violent action is underway. By daylight they will know of it anyhow, and will be told by him then of its purpose, and soon the whole country will begin to apprehend its scale. Still, the echoing sound of the first shot shocks the men, and Watson's and Taylor's breathless report that their prisoner has escaped into a hotel frightens them. Father, however, is calm as ice. At this moment he is mainly concerned with Aaron Stevens' mission. He has sent Stephen with Tidd and Cook and 3 of the Negro men, Anderson, Leary, and Green, 5 miles west of Harper's Ferry to Halltown, where resides the wealthy planter Colonel Lewis Washington, a direct descendant of General George Washington and something of a local celebrity and politician. Further, he is known to have inherited an elaborately engraved pistol presented to the general after the Revolution by the Marquis de Lafayette, and a ceremonial sword given him by King Frederick the Great of Prussia. The old man wants Washington as a hostage, and he wants to free the colonel's half-dozen slaves, but most of all, to help place his own acts into their proper context, he wants George Washington's pistol and his sword. Stevens and his men battered down the colonel's door and roused him and his terrified family from their beds. When the colonel has dressed and has delivered over his ancestors' famous weapons, Stevens formally places him under arrest, and leaving the man's wife and young children behind, seats him next to Tidd in a 2-horse carriage appropriated from the barn. Behind them, Anderson, Leary, and Green have hitched the colonel's 4 remaining horses to a farm wagon and have placed into it 3 liberated slaves, all they could find in the house and barn. They start back towards Harper's Ferry. A mile west of Bolivar Heights, they draw up before a large farm owned by John Allstadt, after Washington, the wealthiest planter in the region and a slaveholder. Stevens and his men quickly make hostages of Mr. Allstadt and his 18-year-old son, and unceremoniously liberate Allstadt's 4 slaves, who are added to the group in the farm wagon. As instructed, the raiders are scrupulously polite to their prisoners and to the women and children. Back at Harper's Ferry at 1:25 a.m., precisely as scheduled, the Baltimore-bound B&O passenger train rolls in, and when it has hissed to a noisy stop at the station, the night clerk from the hotel next door skitters low from the door of the railroad station, and before the conductor can step down from the train, the man has leapt aboard, bearing the startling news that gunmen are out on the Potomac Bridge and have shot a watchman. Worse, the other 3 town watchmen are nowhere about and may even have been murdered. And here's something else. When the clerk slips unseen into the station by a rear window, he tried to telegraph the station master in Charlestown and discovered that the wires had been cut. There is something very strange, something dangerous happening, and until now, with no idea of how many gunmen might be out there, no one but the night clerk has dared to leave the hotel or been able to raise a general alarm. The conductor, A.J. Phelps, takes immediate action and directs the engineer and the baggage master, who carries a pistol, to investigate the bridge, for it may have been sabotaged. Who knows but what these gunmen are train robbers and have blocked the bridge somehow? If the tracks appear clear, he says, they straightway will pass across the river, and at the station in Monocacy in Maryland will telegraph the news of these startling events over to Charlestown, where there is a federal marshal's office and a regiment of town militia available for help. Sleepy passengers peer out their windows, wondering why the delay, as the engineer and the baggage master, his pistol at the ready, walk slowly along the station platform, step down to the rail bed, and crunch over the gravel towards the covered bridge. When the pair are about 15 feet from the entrance, Watson speaks from the darkness. "Drop your pistol, sir, and both of you walk slowly towards us. Keep your hands in full view. You will not be harmed if you do as we say."